Hey everyone, Blake again with ChessPathways.com, and today we're talking about the Italian game, another very popular King's Pawn opening. The Italian game begins with 1 e4, Black responds with e5, we get another symmetrical King's Pawn opening, White plays knight f3 and attacks that pawn, Black goes ahead and defends it and plays knight c6, and now the Italian game is characterized by bishop to c4. This is another very classical, old-school opening that still remains popular to this day. We see that White's following the classical opening principles very well. They controlled some space in the middle, they're developing some pieces, and they're able to castle very fast in a lot of lines. And unlike the Ruy Lopez, which would be bishop b5, White's not putting this positional pressure on Black, where Black always has to worry that there might be this exchange on the knight and this pawn could be loose. But the bishop on c4 is eyeing the weakest square in the Black position. That's this f7 pawn. This pawn is only defended by the king, and there can be some tactics involving this pawn out of the opening if Black is not careful. So we're going to consider Black's two most popular moves here, by far. And those are knight f6 and bishop c5. Both moves look very reasonable, both developing a piece and getting Black closer to castling. So let's start with knight to f6, where Black is attacking this e4 pawn. Now, there's certainly nothing wrong with this move. It's a perfectly fine move to play, but a lot of unsuspecting players play this move as Black, and they don't realize how dangerous things can get after White plays the super aggressive knight to g5, really bearing down on this f7 pawn with the help of the bishop. A lot of beginners kind of wander into this line with Black not knowing what they're getting themselves into, because knight f6 kind of looks like the most principled move in the world, right? If you've just learned the opening principles, this move makes a ton of sense. You're often taught knights before bishops as a beginner, just kind of as a general principle, because you know this knight belongs on f6. It's definitely the best square for that knight, and you just want to develop your bishop next and get castled. But it turns out knight g5 leads to all kinds of craziness, and that's why if you're a beginner, or you don't want to memorize a ton of opening theory and a lot of memorized lines, I would recommend playing the other move here and playing bishop c5. After knight f6, let's look at what happens after White plays knight to g5. Now at first this looks like a violation of opening principles to move the same piece twice in the opening. White still has all their other pieces to get into the game, and this knight was already developed, yet they just moved it again. But it turns out, from a concrete perspective, it's actually kind of hard for Black to deal with this. And this is a really unique line in the King's Pawn opening in that almost every continuation from here involves some kind of sacrifice. Either White sacrifices material or sometimes Black sacrifices material, but one way or the other, someone sacrifices something in almost every possible continuation. So let's see what's going on here. White has two attackers on this f7 square now. Black only has one defender, and you of course can't use the queen to reinforce it. Now there are two defenders, so you might think it's safe, but if White takes here and you take back, of course Black comes out ahead for the battle for the square because they had enough defenders, but of course you don't want to trade the queen for a knight and bishop. That's not good. So Black cannot play queen to e7. So it seems like the only way to defend this pawn is to play d5. And now let's say White takes that pawn, and let's say Black takes back. And at first it looks like this operation has been a complete failure for White. Now this knight's attacked by the queen. Black has a space advantage in the center. They have the only central pawn remaining. This knight's perfectly safe here, defended by the queen. And if this knight has to retreat, this whole operation made no sense for White, and it looks like White just got punished for breaking those opening principles. But not so fast. White has a surprising sacrifice here. Knight takes f7. This is the infamous fried liver attack. I'm not sure how it got that name, but here's the point. So the rook and queen are forked. Black has no choice but to accept the knight sacrifice. And now after queen f3 check, this king cannot retreat. If the king steps back to e8, which is a mistake I see some beginners make when they get surprised by this line, now White simply wins their piece back, and this is horrible for Black. White's not down a piece anymore because they just won it back. Black is down a pawn. Black can't castle. White's threatening checkmate. This is very, very bad for Black. So the only way Black can play here to stay up a piece is to play king e6, adding a second defender to this knight. And Black remains up a piece. Black's up a whole knight here for a pawn, which is a lot of material to be up, but of course it's very dangerous to have your king on this ridiculous square e6. You almost never see that in the opening, and White will play knight c3 and keep adding pressure to this pinned knight. Black has to reinforce that knight somehow. It certainly can't move, and just to show one of these crazy continuations, let's say Black plays knight b4, reinforcing this knight. White will sometimes just kick that knight away, not even caring that he's getting forked. And there's a line that goes knight takes c2. Black wins the rook in the corner, but now white takes this knight, and they're threatening all kinds of discovered attacks on this king if this knight moves away. White's down a lot of material, but it's going to be hard for this black king to survive, and the tiniest mistake could be a disaster for black. So that's, again, a very dangerous line to walk into if you don't know what's going on. So a lot of players with black don't want that. They don't want their king on e6. Very understandable. So instead, let's say they play d5, almost forced to defend f7. And now after white takes, black has some other ideas here besides playing the natural move to take back. Black can play this surprising move b5. This pawn's not defended, but if the bishop were to take this pawn, then black succeeds in getting this bishop off this dangerous diagonal, and black could go ahead and take with the queen and attack that bishop. So instead, after b5, white usually plays the surprising move bishop f1, just showing how strange some of these lines are. But now they have the idea that if the knight takes on d5, now they'll take on b5 when the queen can't come out and attack the bishop, and they have this pin on the knight. And if the queen takes on d5, now they can play knight c3, forking the queen and pawn, and they'll get the pawn back later under better circumstances. And this queen will have to move again right away, and meanwhile the queen's not able to take this loose g2 pawn thanks to this surprising retreat bishop f1. So again, we're seeing sacrifices and counter-sacrifices everywhere in this whole knight g5 line. Alright, so let's recap. After d5, which is black's really only attempt to save this f7 pawn, after white takes, we've looked at knight takes d5, we've looked at the surprising b5, but by far black's most popular option is knight to a5, attacking this bishop. So right now white is still up a pawn, because white took this pawn here on d5 and black did not recapture. But if white retreats this bishop somewhere, like to e2, black will simply take back the pawn, and again, white's whole operation is a failure. Black has the lone pawn in the center, the knight makes no sense now without the bishop helping it out. So white's really only choice here is to play bishop b5, and in this continuation, white stays up a pawn for good. They were able to trade off that extra pawn. They have 7 pawns to black's 6, but the point of this pawn sacrifice from black's perspective is it discoordinates the white pieces. The bishop can't come back to c4, the bishop's under attack, and now this knight really does make no sense here on g5. For example, one of the possible continuations here goes bishop to e2, a safe square for that bishop, but now h6, the knight has to retreat. e4, the knight's getting kicked around, and we see that the black pieces have lots of open space. Both bishops have open lines of development, the queen can come out to the center at some point, and despite being down a pawn, black has some pretty good compensation here, because white was forced to kind of go back and forth in the opening all over the place. The bishop was moving all over the place, ends up back on e2, and black can try to punish white for playing this unprincipled opening, moving the same piece twice in the opening, but it does cost them a pawn to get this position. So we've looked at all the craziness that can occur after black plays d5 here, but if you thought the craziness of this line was over, you'd be wrong. Black has another surprising option here to just play bishop c5 and not even defend their f7 pawn, which looks completely ridiculous to allow knight takes f7 or bishop takes f7, but surprisingly black has some ideas here. This is called the Traxler counter gambit, another line where black sacrifices some material. So let's look at what happens. What if white plays knight takes f7, forking the rook and queen? Now black can play bishop takes f2, exposing the white king. Often white will play king f1 here, but let's say white accepts this sacrifice. Now black gets to play knight takes e4. And after something like king to g1, now black can play queen h4. Getting out of this fork, white cannot take this rook because black's threatening checkmate. And black is down a bishop for the time being, but now the white king looks to be in danger. So needless to say, after knight f6, knight g5 leads to an extremely complicated line. And unless you like this kind of stuff, unless you like memorizing and studying these deep, complex lines, I would recommend you not enter this line with either color, because these are the kind of lines where if your opponent knows more about the variation than you do, you could end up in a lot of trouble. So as white here, of course, you don't have to play knight g5. You can play d3, you can play castles, and play will go a lot more similarly to what happens after black plays bishop c5 instead of knight f6, which is what we're going to look at next. Okay, so after bishop c4, let's say black does not play knight f6 and they choose to play bishop c5 instead. This is called the Giuoco Piano, which means quiet game in Italian, and compared to the insanity we just saw, this game is definitely going to be a lot more quiet. A lot of times both players will just simply complete their development. White can certainly try to strike in the center with c3 and d4 like we saw in the Ruy Lopez. It's worth mentioning, now that black has developed this bishop, they never have to fear knight g5 again, at least not in the near future. For example, after castles, now black can put this knight on f6 with no concern, because if white plays knight g5 now, this really is just a bad move. Black can simply castle because this bishop's not in the way, and f7 is perfectly well defended. Black adds a second defender to f7, and now this knight makes no sense here at all. It's just going to get kicked away in the near future, and that would not be a good choice for white. Also, of course, white cannot play it on move 4 anymore, because without the knight on f6, this queen would just take that knight. So playing bishop c5 pretty much avoids any concern with this whole knight g5 stuff. So after bishop c5, again, we saw white can castle, knight f6. If white plays d3, defending this pawn, this is called the Giuoco Pianissimo, the very quiet game. It's definitely not one of white's more ambitious choices, but there's certainly nothing wrong with it. White can either just keep developing and put the knight on c3 next turn, or white can play c3, leaving the option to play d4 later and enter a more slow maneuvering game, maybe improving the rook and then swinging the knight around to the king side. We've seen that idea in the Ruy Lopez. And again, just to reiterate, if black chooses to play this line with knight f6, white does not have to play knight g5 and go for this line. White could simply play d3, and now black probably has nothing better than to just keep developing. And we just transpose to the Giuoco Pianissimo. It's just as if black played the bishop c5 line to begin with, instead of playing knight f6 on move 3. So if white does not play knight g5 against knight f6, play is going to be very similar to what happens in the bishop c5 lines anyways. So as we've seen with the Giuoco Pianissimo, a lot of these lines after bishop c5 are going to be more about ideas and maneuvering and developing, rather than complex, sharp, tactical variations. It's called the quiet game for a reason, after all. But there are some concrete variations to know, so let's highlight two of white's more ambitious attempts against bishop c5. The first is to strike very fast in the center with c3 and d4, so let's take a look. Let's say white plays c3, black plays the very normal knight to f6, attacking the e4 pawn. White plays d4 and attacks that bishop, grabbing more space in the center. And remember, whenever you create pawn tension, you always want to make sure you have enough support to do it. Black has 3 attackers on this d4 pawn, but white has 3 supporters there, so we're good. And after black exchanges, white takes. White controls the whole center temporarily, but black can play bishop b4 check. And after, for example, bishop to d2 blocking that check, black can take there on d2. White can take, and it looks like white still has control of the whole center. White's getting ready to push forward and bully these knights, but black's just in time to strike back, and black can play d5 and kind of get some space for himself. Again, 2 attackers on that pawn. Black has enough support. They have 2 defenders, and black stakes out some space for themselves in the center. So that's one way the game can go if white tries to play c3 and d4 very fast. Let's go back after bishop c5 and highlight an even more aggressive option for white, and that is to play this surprising move b4, which is called the Evans Gambit. Now at first this move looks pretty ridiculous, right? It looks like white's just handing black a pawn for no good reason, and black can certainly take this pawn, but because we've seen white's idea there to play c3 and d4, we can start to understand the idea here. White wants to force a black piece to come to the b4 square, so they can play c3 with tempo, kick that piece away, and then play d4 next turn, and they kind of buy some time for themselves to expand in the center really fast. So let's just look at how things can go. Black can take here on b4. Black's now up a pawn. c3. Let's say bishop to a5. And now d4, and white was able to get the center before black is ready to organize a strike with d5, like we saw in the last example. Now at first it looks like this might not be the best thing for white to do because this c-pawn is pinned to the king, so this pawn cannot help out supporting the d-pawn, and that's one of the reasons black chose a5 in this particular example. So after black takes there, white's not going to take back right away. White can simply castle, and white's down 2 pawns temporarily. But white has a lot of very aggressive attacking ideas. In some lines, the queen comes to b3, helping to eye this f7 pawn. If the knight ever comes to f6, white can try to kick it away with a very fast e5. For example, let's say that black plays d takes c3 here, making sure they stay up 2 pawns. White can play queen b3, threatening to take on f7 now, and it's not so easy for black to defend it. For example, after queen to f6, white gets to play e5. And even though black has 2 attackers on this pawn and white only has 1 defender, it would not be possible to take this pawn. For example, after knight takes e5, knight takes e5, queen takes e5, and now white gets to take on f7, Plus, the king and queen being lined up on this file could be very dangerous if white is able to play rook e1 in the near future. So that's a brief overview of the Evans Gambit, which is probably white's most aggressive option against the bishop c5 Giuoco Piano line of the Italian. I might speculate that a lot of players who like to play knight g5 against knight f6 might like playing b4 against bishop c5 if they're that aggressive, sacrificial kind of player. And I think that's a cool thing about the Italian game, that it kind of has something for almost any kind of player. From the very quiet and positional Giuoco Pianissimo to the very crazy, hyper-tactical, aggressive knight g5, almost anyone can find a line that interests them in the Italian game. Thank you very much for watching, and make sure you visit chesspathways.com right now and get signed up. You just have to put in your email address. It takes just a couple seconds, totally free, and I will send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you join our Chess Pathways community. Thanks.